Some blouses have a little feature that's maybe decorative or in some cases functional. And if you have a high-ish neckline, you probably need a little opening on the back seam to open up and get in so your head can fit through. I'm going to show you 2 ways to do this, one with a center back seam, but I've got a little hack that allows you to get the same thing without that center back seam, and that could help you in some cases. Hi sewing friends, I'm Karina from liftingpinsandneedles.com. Welcome to this channel that is all about sewing. The first episode of 2024. Welcome to a new year. I'm excited. This is the first sewing content of the year. Many more to come. There's always practical things for you over here at Lifting Pins and Needles, so make sure you're subscribed. Tap on the notifications so you don't miss out when I upload new content. And I've got a technique video for you. This could work for a lot of patterns, lots of woven tops usually. Most of the times you have a roundish neckline that sometimes is high, sometimes is low, but then at the back you see a center back seam with a little slit, little loop and a button. Look, to be honest, it's not my favorite thing, but sometimes it is needed for functionality because the neckline can be a little higher, and if you didn't have that opening at the back, you wouldn't be able to put your head through. So if I determine that the circumference, the finished circumference is smaller than my head circumference, I will have to do that slit. There are a few cases where that little detail on the back is mostly decorative. I know it can look really delicate if you're wearing a high ponytail and whatnot, but sometimes you don't need it. Like the neckline is low enough, the circumference is large enough for you to just pull it on over your head. And in most of the cases, I don't do it. I just eliminate it. I just sew the center back seam and I don't do it. But everyone has their own preference, and I'm sure a lot of you will enjoy that. So I'm going to show you how to do these 2 ways. These 2 technique videos that you're going to see are based on a pattern I'm going to show next in the next video. Really nice pattern. It's a free pattern. This technique is general for everything though, so I'm making it its own little separate video. You'll see the finished garment super soon here on the channel. One little announcement before. Love Notions is going to run a New Year's sale from next week, from the 8th to the 12th, from Monday through Friday. The whole site would be 30% off, except for the encore skirt, which was the last pattern release. So if you wanted to get some patterns and get them for a little bit less, go have a look and make your wish list. My code for January, February and March is 10 Karina now. 10 with small Karina, no capitals, and you'll get an extra 10% off on top of sale prices. So I'm just letting you know, it's before the sale starts, so you'll be prepared. The traditional way, where you do have that center back seam, where we have a facing finish on the neckline. This is all about the sewing technique. So let's see. The original pattern has a center back seam, and for the first little section it's going to be open as a slit. From here on until the bottom we're going to sew. Now all the seam allowances on this blouse are 3/8 of an inch, except the center back seam, which is 5/8 of an inch. Clearly marked in the pattern, and there's a little line in the instructions that say, and depends on what size you're sewing, you're going to have a little line there. I've got a pin to mark that area, and that's where I'm going to start, reinforce, and then keep going down and leave this part up here open. If you can tell, the edges have already been serged separately. I did that before, pinning it all together. I'm sewing it now, and when I press it open, the edges will have already been serged. I think it's just easier that way sometimes, especially if you have smaller seam allowances. In this case, it's 5/8, so I could have serged it after sewing the seam. I usually tend to serge first and then sew the seam when I know that I'm going to be pressing the seam open. After sewing the center back seam right there, I've gone ahead and given it a good press. There isn't a little pattern piece to make the loops for this blouse. It just says to cut a little strip that's about 10 centimeters long or 4 inches. So I've done that, and I've just eyeballed 3/4 of an inch wide here, or 2 centimeters. So I'm just going to sew this with a really small seam allowance. Then I don't have to trim anything away. And then I'm going to turn it the other way with a tiny safety pin. I found this in my mom's stash of safety pins. It's really small and it's going to get the job done. I've never had any specific tool for turning things. I know there are tools like that. I don't feel that I need them because a safety pin always does the trick. I'm going to be sewing right in the middle here. So there it is. You can see I've got a fair amount of seam allowance, a bit more than 1/8 of an inch. So I think that's enough. It's not going to come undone. Over here, I'm going to poke the pin at least 1/4 of an inch down from the edge so that I have a nice amount grabbed there, and then just start turning it. Lots of patience. This is a really lightweight fabric, so it shouldn't be a problem. I would not be happy to do a loop like this with a rayon twill, for example. I think that would be really heavy and bulky, but this is very lightweight stuff. This is way longer than what it has to be. We're going to trim a lot of this away. And there we have it, done, turned. Here we have the neckline. Looking at it on the back area, these seam allowances have been pressed. We know that when we sew the facing on, we're going to use a 3/8 seam allowance. So we need to position the loop at least 3/8 of an inch from there. A little bit more, like a tiny bit more, so it doesn't get in the way of that seam. So I'm just going to put a pin to reference where I want to place this loop. You need to extend the seam allowance that has been pressed, that memory crease, you need to ignore it. Now we can just form this shape here and place it right there. You don't want it too long or else it's going to grab the button, but it's always going to be falling out, so you should want it to be fairly small. I'm leaving about 1/2 an inch right there from that memory crease, and I'm just going to pin this in place and give it a quick hand base to hold it there. You could tack it down with a machine, but it's such a tiny thing. I'm just quickly going to do a few stitches here with a needle and thread, and these are not going to be seen later on, and it's going to keep that in place. This for now is just going to stay there, and next we need to assemble the facing. Once the facing is done and we sew it into the neckline, then this is going to make more sense. But for now, we just leave it hand basted on. Remember, we're basting it onto the right side of the garment. Afterwards, this is going to come out like this on the edge, and you're going to have a button on this other side. So I feel this is pretty firm. It's not going to go anywhere, and I'm doing it in red so you can see these stitches are all going to be hidden afterwards. Here we have the facing pieces. This is the front, and then for the back we have two. I'm going to align them over here at the shoulders, and we're going to get these little seams sewn. After these two seams are sewn, we're going to serge the edges. You know what comes next. After assembling the facing and serging the edges, we can just pin it to the neckline. I've already pinned it. I've gone through that process, but then I went the extra mile and hand basted it. Just because it's rayon, it's just a little more slippery than other fabrics. So you can see that at the back we have this going on. The edge of the facing reaches the edge of the back piece. We have that memory crease from before. And now when we sew this section here is going to be sewn at 5/8 on these center backs, but then from here around the actual neckline is going to be at 3/8. So we're not going to use the same seam allowance to sew the facing on, and that's fine. When we flip this the other way, then the loop's going to come out cleanly through the corner, and we're going to have a clean finish on the top of the slit, and the rest will just have that seam allowance folded in. So I've made sure to match the shoulder seams right here. Even though I've hand basted it, I always like to keep that pin in place because it really holds the seams together. I remove it at the last second. So we'll just go ahead and get this sewn. I'm going to start over here. Remember, this part is at 5/8 up to there, and then we switch to 3/8. So much easier to manage a curved seam like this with hand basting instead of pins, in my opinion. And hand basting takes no time to do, so it's always worth it. Here I can feel the bulk of the loop. I'm just going to make sure I push it out of the way as much as I can so I don't catch the actual loop here. And then this other short end is also at 5/8. Here on the top, I'm just going to trim away a little smaller. Get rid of all the excess loop here as well. I'm going to trim like this. The basting stitch can come out in one go. This is curved all the way around, so the snips are very important. You can trim smaller if you want to, but I think 3/8 of an inch is acceptable to leave inside a seam allowance. I don't think it creates bulk, especially in a lightweight fabric like this. So you can trim a little smaller if you want, but I think 3/8 is okay. Now to flip these corners, I'm just going to fold these seam allowances here onto themselves, hold it there and flip to the other side. And here we have that loop coming out right there super neatly. It's really small. I think it's enough for a smallish button right there. That's how this is going to look on the inside, super neat. Do the same on the other side. This side doesn't have any loop or bulk there, so it's going to be even cleaner. Look at that little point, really nice. So now we need to do some understitching. I'm just going to hold that seam allowance underneath the facing here, and we're going to sew on the edge right there. We can't get up to the very corner, but as close as we can, and then go around the neckline for the understitching. For understitching, I have the facing on my left hand. I've been to the iron and pressed everything super neatly. Now over here, I just want to do a few hand tacks inside, and I want to just hold the facing down to the seam allowance here where the slit is. Just a few little stitches, nothing that's going to be visible on the outside. I also want to do the same on the shoulder seams. This is definitely not a facing I would want to top stitch down, especially with lightweight rayon. I never really enjoy doing that. So over here as well, just where the shoulder seam is, I'm going to do another little stitch right here. Nothing fancy. I don't give you names of hand sewing because I just don't do anything fancy that requires a name. That's it. And I'll just repeat the same thing on the other side. There's a little loop made out of fabric. Opening's about 3 inches, which is enough. And then you have the center back seam there. So it's pretty easy. The facing is inside, it's all understitched, and you get a really nice result. This is how the neckline looks on the inside. Facing is just loose like that. It's never going to come out. It's all understitched, it's all fixed in place. This is how it looks like from the inside. Very nice. And then there's the opening right there. Very neat. In the majority of cases, I don't mind there being a center back seam. I actually like it. Sometimes it's easier to place your pattern pieces on the fabric as well. Usually the front is on the fold, the back is not. So in that case, it's easy. But what happens if you have a print that you don't really want to mess up? So I made this same blouse with a polka dot print. Very hard to match up those polka dots because they don't have like an organized way of the polka dots. The polka dots have different sizes as well. So I decided I did not want to have a center back seam. I still wanted to have that little opening to get my head through. So I just fiddled around with the pattern pieces a little bit to create a hack. You can do this to any pattern, and I think you could even do this to the front of a pattern. It would look really cute. Let's see the easy modification to the pattern. The polka dots, but they are so uneven and asymmetric in the print. I can't really match up the back seam. So I'm going to put the back seam on the fold. Just let me show you what I'm going to do. It's going to fit the same, look the same, no one's going to know. So this is the back. I've just folded away the seam allowance. It's easy to see where the seam allowance is there. There's a line. So I've just folded that away. On the pattern, there's a little line up to where you sew the seam and then you leave it open. So I've just transferred that mark a little inward so I know where it is for the size that I'm sewing. And I've gotten rid of the seam allowance. That means I can cut the back on the fold. But because this is a higher neckline, I still need that open area to get my head through. Otherwise, my head is not going to fit. I'm going to modify the back facing. So this is the back facing here. I've also folded away the seam allowance so that it's not there anymore to match what's up there. And then I've just added extra paper. So I've matched everything up right there. If I lift this, I know that the seam has to go up to there, and I've made my facing a little longer than that, about 1 inch. So my facing is going to include that, but also this area there. So I can sew down a little line of stitching here, open it up, and I'm going to have a little slit there without needing that center back seam to be there. The line is going to be up to here. That's where I'm going to do the line of sewing. You'll see that when I sew it. And I'll have a little extra fabric. And then I've just done this by eyeballing. I've just freehand drawn this line over here up to there, and that's just going to make the back facing bigger to include this area there. Then I'm going to cut this new facing on the fold. This is going to look really funny now. I'm going to cut it on the fold, and that is going to include the little slit I'm going to do there. I'm still going to be able to open that up, do the little loop and the button, everything the same. It's just that I won't need that center back seam all the way down, and I won't need to worry about the dots getting distorted. So you can try this if you have a print that you don't want to mess up on the back. The back, these are swing style. The back has absolutely no shaping. It's totally straight, so it's not like it's affecting the feet or anything. Here we can see the back facing, the actual shape once I cut it on the fold, modified to include that central area. So it's a little different. If I place this over here onto the neckline, it matches perfectly. And right there in the center, I drew a line with a friction pen, and that's where I'm going to sew around to have a little slit. So facing is interface, but I am going to be cutting into that main back piece as well. So I've also drawn that center line with a friction pen there, and I want to stabilize it with a bit of interfacing too. So I just cut a little piece, probably 1.5 inches wide, a little longer than what the line is, so it's a little more covered. And now I'm just going to fuse that on. I'm going to lose the mark of the friction pen, but that mark was just there to help me center the interfacing right there, because when I place these right sides together, the line on the facing, that's the one that's going to be my reference right there. So you can see that both layers, both the main and the facing, are going to have that area interface. So once we have the pattern pieces, the treatment and the sewing of the facing is going to be very similar, with one difference. So let's see how to do this modified version in the case that you just don't want a center back seam, or because you have a super pretty print that you don't want to mess up with a seam. This is a modified back facing piece aligned at the shoulder seams with the front facing piece. So I'm just going to go ahead and sew these shoulder seams. Then I'm going to press that seam allowance open. After pressing the shoulder seams open, I'm going to serge all around the raw edges, the outside of the facing, the outer edge. Around this small curve, I'm going very slowly. This one was cut on the fold, so I don't have that extra seam allowance there. You saw previously that I'd stabilized that area there, so and this is all going to match around the neckline. It's just that we're going to sew into that line right there. So I'm just going to get everything hand basted on, and then we'll deal with this little back area. I've basted the facing all the way around the top of the neckline, but over here where we're going to do the slit, I was careful to place this flat against the iron so everything matches up nice down here. Remember, I had centered interfacing over here, so I made sure that was nice and straight and nice and neat. And now I'm going to do some hand basting right along this line to hold these two layers together so they don't move around at all. This is important for the slit to come out nice and neat and have the fabric not wiggle anywhere else. I think this is fast and easy and can be a solution if you don't want that center back seam there, if you don't need it. In my case, I don't mind there being a center back seam, but I was really disturbed with the polka dots being messed up. So that is the reason why I'm doing this. I'm going to start sewing this facing around this area with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to go all the way around the edge. When I get to here, I'm going to stop about 1/8 of an inch before the line, and I'm going to sew about 1/8 of an inch out of the line down to that point, and then I'm going to come up with the same distance, about 1/8 of an inch up to there, and then I'm going to keep going and finish there. And then with the scissors, I'm going to cut right in the middle of the slit and then turn this inside out, and we're still going to have that slit there that will allow this to open up. This would not fit my head. It's just a small circumference. Neckline is higher, so this is really needed for functionality of the garment. It's not just a decorative feature. Now we're getting close to that line. I'm going to stop sewing here just a tad before the line, 1/8 of an inch. And I'm going to sew close to that line at up to the bottom point. Turn this thing all the way around and go back up the other side. Took the hand basting out so that it's easy to see what happened right here there. You can see the line in the middle and how we've sewn around it, just leaving a small tiny space in the middle now to cut open. You need at least 1/4 inch in here because you're going to cut through and you need some seam allowance left in there. That 1/4 inch is not going to make any difference in the grand scheme of things. Because we're going to have a small seam allowance left in there, that's why I thought it was important for both the facing and the neckline area to be interfaced. If this was just a single layer here, it would leave the fabric more vulnerable with such a small seam allowance to fraying and holes. So this is why I wanted to stabilize this area as well as the facing for this technique. So I'm just going to fold this over here like this. I'm not going to sew a loop into this one. You're going to get that nice clean edge on the neckline right there. And these facings all going to go to the inside, and we're going to have a lovely little slit there without having the seam. I'm going to get my mum to sew me a loop by hand right there. If you really wanted, you could have put the loop in there the same as we did with the other one, but it just gets trickier because of the small seam allowance left in there. So that's why no loop over here. We shouldn't forget to snip here because this neckline is really curved. I'm not going to trim away the seam allowance. I think 3/8 of an inch is okay to leave in there. It's lightweight fabric, but I am going to do quite a few snips around everywhere here. And as with any other facing, we understitch. So we push the seam allowance underneath the facing here, and we sew on the edge to keep that facing inside. Here I've got my blouse on the ironing board, and I've just pushed the facing to the inside now. We can give it a good press. I'm not concerned that this is going to come out. The understitching is going to keep it inside. On the back I want to get everything nice and neat as well, especially in that corner there. You can see the modified area for the back facing. That area that was interfaced in there is going to be hidden behind it, so that interfaced area is never going to be seen. But it does give you a really clean slit right here that is going to allow this to open. I'm going to hand baste the facing down on the back, and I am going to top stitch it down on the back. I want to really protect this area right here. It's not going to be something too noticeable, I think. And the front, I'm going to leave it loose. This is something optional that I'm opting to do. You could definitely just leave it like this if you wanted to. Here you can see the blue hand basting. I did hold this flat in place. I hand basted it while keeping it flat here, just moving the needle along like that to make sure nothing moves. Now I'm going to sew it down. I'm going to do it from the wrong side because on my machine it looks exactly the same, and I'll just guide myself along the serged edge, the inner edge there of the serged area, and just hold that down, and that's going to protect that tiny seam allowance inside. This is how the top stitching looks like on the right side. I think it looks pretty discreet, and it gives me a lot of peace of mind that that facing is flat and it's going to be fixed in there. Now here, I didn't back tack when I started, so I've just gotten that thread from the top and put it through a needle, and then I'm just going to push it back manually. Find my bobbin thread here from the bottom and just do a little knot, and that gives you a really clean finish there without any back tacking and sewing going back and forth there. This is the result here. The polka dots, you can see they would have been impossible to match, and I would have ruined the look there. I really dislike the look of polka dots cut in half and them just being messy, so I decided this was a good option for this print. And you can see the top stitching there is very discreet, holding that tiny modified facing on the back in place, and we still have this little slit, the little loop, and the button right there. Very pretty. No one's ever going to see the difference. I wear my hair down anyway. It's rare that I'll ever show it off on a high ponytail. This is how the neckline looks on the inside. Regular facing like always, understitched. I've left it just loose over here. In this case, I did decide to top stitch it down around this section. Here you see the modified facing and the little slit right there, which is super neat. Really love it. I hope this was practical. Maybe you want to add these little openings to your garments. Maybe you encounter these little things on your blouses and they won't seem so foreign because you've seen them sewn here. And if you want to be a little more adventurous and get rid of seams and change facings around a little bit, you can always do so many things in sewing. And sometimes the reason can be just for aesthetics. Don't want to mess up the polka dots, but that's important for me, and I was dead set on using this fabric for this blouse. I didn't want to choose another fabric, and I didn't want to mess up the polka dots, and that was enough reason for me to go and do all those little extra steps. But I'm happy I have the content here for you. I hope you enjoyed. Next, you'll see a video all about these tops, they're blouses. It's a free pattern, so don't miss out, and I'll see you here very soon. Bye.